What is up, everybody? It's Revv time. Today I want to talk about kind of the differences between what I would consider kind of a vintage amp tone as opposed to a more kind of modern amp tone, but solely from my perspective. This isn't about, well, one amp's going to be great for metal and the other one's going to be great for, I don't know, country or the blues or classic rock. It's not so much that. It's just how certain more kind of modern sounds would make me play. Maybe I'll pick up a different guitar for the more kind of modern thing, just to give you, like I said, my just my view on, you know, more of a vintage tone like I have going on here, and how that feels and sounds compared to a more what I would consider a modern tone. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean modern high gain, even though high gain is attached to the whole modern thing, because for the most part they were taking vintage circuits and just figuring out with all the black magic voodoo that these talented builders have at their disposal, changing the vintage circuits to have quite a bit more gain. But let's just start with what I got going right now. So for me, especially on the Revv, the 120, the green channel is definitely more kind of a vintage feel and tone to my ears. There's not a lot of gain going on. And to me, there's just a little bit of squish in it. You know, the amps from back in the day kind of varied. So some of the amps had a little bit of squish, like a JTM, like a Marshall, would have a little bit more kind of squish to it. Whereas some plexis I've played that were, you know, 60s plexis were actually pretty, like, spot on fast, you know, not as forgiving as you would think. But for the most part, you know, to me, vintage amps have a pretty big, just kind of dynamic range. Of course, I can turn the gain up a little bit. You see I've got the treble at about 2 o'clock. Everything else is pretty close to noon. So I like the gain about right there. It definitely breaks up, it responds dynamically, but when I play softer, it's still got, you know, it responds accordingly to almost dead clean. If I go to a neck position, so that's kind of that response. You know, we can do more gain. If I add more gain, turn the bass down, which is typically what would happen on kind of more vintagey circuits. As you turn the gain up, you do have to turn the bass down to keep it controlled sounding. If I turn the bass back up, it's fine. It's just not there isn't as much clarity there. I mean, that's to each his own, but for the most part, I always, as I turn gain up on almost any amp with a vintage style circuit, or I shouldn't even say that, just most tube amps, I end up turning the bass down on them when I'm cranking up the gain. But even at that much gain, I would put that into like maybe an unmodified like JCM territory. And turn the gain all the way up. Okay, so that's good on that channel. Now, what I think I'll do is I'll switch channels. Let me switch guitars as well. I'm going to switch to channel 3, and I'll pick up a different guitar. Now, this guitar, I don't look at this guitar and go, oh, there's a modern guitar. There's modern characteristics to it, but it still can sound extremely vintage. But I'll show you why I'm picking up this guitar in particular. And I'll kind of just dial as I go. Okay, that's already kind of modern, more modern kind of high gain tone. And that sounds fine, and the first thing it did is it made me play differently. All of a sudden I'm pinch harmonics and I'm playing faster and more aggressive, and that's kind of what a modern kind of high gain amp is gonna do, or I should just say like a modern tone. It's a little more compressed. I'll probably turn up the level a little bit. So it's got all the sting, but the reason it works good with this guitar is this guitar has a boost circuit that I could use. I'm not necessarily going to use a boost circuit, but if I turn it on without adding boost, it actually makes the guitar more active, almost not, I don't want to say it's like a set of EMGs, but it does give it that kind of active tone. So check it out. There's the circuit off. So it adds some low and some definite kind of top end. Now I can add a little bit of treble to that. It seems like I could use a little more up top. So that's not a ton of gain, but that to me sounds like a modern amplifier, and I'm adding kind of a more modern tonality on especially on this back humbucker from the guitar. So I'm not a metal player, but when I play a higher gain amp, that's what I gravitate towards. I just kind of like this kind of slick feel and gain. I dig how the single notes feel and kind of react. And then if I want it to sound a little slicker, I can, maybe turn up the delay. And you're just hearing the delay that I have going in Pro Tools. Now with this channel, I mean, that's a lot of gain, but I can go ahead and make it sound less modern, really. Simply by just changing that this guitar to be a passive again. To me, that sounds a little more kind of a vintage modified amp. And then here's with active. But yeah, like in a session environment, I would gravitate towards this guitar because not only can it do great vintage stuff and it feels killer, but it's also capable of that more kind of modern, active pickup tone. So in a session, I would reach for this. I'd probably go channel 3 on the Revv that sounds killer. Now these channels, they dial really nicely. In other words, if you don't want it to sound like that, then don't dial it that way. But the third channel is, and of course the fourth channel as well, are very capable of what would be considered a modern high gain or modern tone. But to me, it's a feel thing, and it is modern, but I don't think, oh, well, that's only going to be this style if I'm going to use that tone. It's just that's how the amp kind of leads me to play. It doesn't really lead me to play metal necessarily, and certainly not gent, because I just can't do it. If I could, I would. So that's, I was just trying to kind of, this was kind of bouncing around like a marble in my empty skull. So I just kind of wanted to, talk about it and also get you guys' thoughts on it as far as what do you guys consider a vintage amp? Do you guys think a vintage amp should really be from the 50s and down? Should it be 60s and down? Should it just be an old like Champ? What is your kind of favorite when you think vintage amp? Do you think AC30? Do you think even blackface Fender? To me, I tend to think like a Tweed 59 to me is the first thing that pops into my head as far as like a vintage amp. And then modern amp wise, I lean towards, you got Diesel, you got Revv, you got Boogie. There's a bunch of them, so Saldano. Even though Saldano, that's a tough one because the Saldano has such a vintage vibe to it, but is capable of high gain. But maybe a Saldano SLO, like a 100 or something, maybe. But that's what I'm asking you guys. What do you guys think when you think vintage amp versus more modern amp? What's the first amp that pops into your head? And same with guitars, like, vintage guitar versus modern guitar, what pops into your head? So as always, I really appreciate you guys watching. We do, a video once a week on certain topics, whether it's, 70s, 80s tones, 90s tones, whatever, all the way to things like this, where it's more just kind of a vlog with me just kind of going, bleh, what do you guys think? So as always, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.